It all started with something small, a seemingly insignificant dispute over property boundaries. I never expected it to escalate the way it did. My land, a quiet stretch of green with a creek running along one side, was the kind of place I cherished for its solitude and beauty. I had always taken pride in maintaining it, keeping the trees trimmed and the grass mowed. The creek was a perfect place for fishing and reflection, and I had just enough room for a small garden and a couple of beehives. Then Karen Davis, my neighbor, started planting a fence along what she claimed was the boundary line between our properties. At first, I thought it was an innocent mistake. After all, property lines can be confusing. But when I realized the fence was encroaching onto my land and blocking my access to the creek, I knew something had to be done. I approached her politely, armed with the legal documents that clearly marked the boundaries. I thought that would be the end of it. After all, I was only asking her to respect the land and follow the law. But Karen wasn't having it. She became defensive, insisting that her fence was well within her rights. When I pointed out the discrepancies, she became hostile, accusing me of being unreasonable. I was taken aback but tried to stay calm. I explained that if she didn't move the fence, I'd be forced to take legal action. The situation escalated when Karen called the sheriff, claiming that I was harassing her. Deputy Rogers arrived at the scene, and I could tell he had dealt with property disputes before. I handed him the surveyor's report, which clearly showed the boundary lines, and he glanced over it quickly. After a moment, he turned to Karen and simply told her, "Ma'am, you're going to need to move this fence. The property line is clearly marked and you're trespassing." Karen's face reddened in frustration, but Deputy Rogers seemed to think that was the end of it. He gave me a reassuring nod and advised me to keep things civil moving forward. For a brief moment, I believed everything was settled. The law was on my side, and Karen had no reason to argue further. But I was wrong. Karen's stubbornness had only begun. Despite the clear legal documents and the deputy's intervention, she refused to back down. Instead of moving the fence, she doubled down, claiming that the HOA had approved her fence. That was a bold claim, one that would soon turn out to be part of a much bigger issue than I could have ever imagined. I had no idea at the time that this small dispute over property lines would soon lead to a much darker and more dangerous game. 2 weeks passed, and I thought perhaps Karen had finally accepted the sheriff's directive to remove the fence. The land had been quiet, and I had gone back to my usual routine of checking the beehives and tending to the garden. But then, I came home one evening to a nightmare. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw it immediately, the unmistakable damage to my fence. It had been cut in 3 places, the wires twisted and pulled apart. The deep tire marks on the ground near the creek were a clear sign that someone had driven through the easement, ignoring the boundary I had worked so hard to protect. I hurried over to the beehives, heart sinking in my chest. One of the hives had been destroyed completely. Frames were scattered like broken toys across the grass, honey dripping down into the soil, a sweet and bitter mess. It wasn't just vandalism, it was personal. Whoever had done this had gone out of their way to destroy my livelihood. But the worst part was that Pixel, my dog, had stepped onto a nail board, one of those makeshift traps meant to cause harm. The poor thing yelped in pain, and I rushed him to the vet. The vet prescribed antibiotics and warned me to watch for infection. As I drove home from the clinic, a burning anger filled me. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. This was sabotage. I had to do something before it escalated further. I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I ordered 4 motion sensor cameras that would alert me every 10 seconds if anything triggered them. I didn't care about the noise, I just needed to know who was behind this. Along with the cameras, I hired a licensed surveyor, Nora Beltran, who was as tough as she was thorough. She arrived the next morning and quickly set to work, marking the corners of my property with fluorescent stakes. She even placed laminated placards explaining the legal consequences of tampering with survey monuments. I wasn't just marking the land, I was sending a message. That night, I sat up late, waiting for any movement on the cameras. Around 1:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. A live alert flashed across the screen, motion detected at the property line. I pulled up the live stream and nearly dropped my phone. Two figures, both wearing hoodies, were on the footage. They were yanking the fluorescent stakes out of the ground and tossing them into the creek. One of them had a set of bolt cutters, and they were cutting the placards that Nora had so carefully placed. It was clear this was no longer about property boundaries. It was about intimidation and control. I zoomed in on their faces. The moonlight caught the face of one figure just enough for me to make out a few features. His face was familiar, a local troublemaker named Chandler who had a reputation for causing trouble in the neighborhood. He was someone Deputy Rogers had dealt with before. The second figure, shorter and with platinum blonde hair, was unmistakable. It was Karen. I was stunned. She had taken things far beyond what I could have imagined. I immediately forwarded the footage to Deputy Rogers and called him. Within hours, he showed up at my door, a grim look on his face as he reviewed the evidence. He was not surprised. "We've had our suspicions about her before," he said, "but this takes it to a whole new level." The next morning, Rogers and two deputies went to Chandler's house. Body cam footage from the encounter showed Chandler, bleary-eyed and wearing pajama pants, denying everything. He insisted he had been asleep all night, but then Rogers simply held up a still image from my camera. Chandler's face was mid-grimace, bolt cutters in hand, as he stood next to Karen. The silence that followed was telling. Chandler quickly shut up, his face drained of color. Karen, on the other hand, was far less cooperative. Rogers found the stolen stakes in her garage, along with the laminated placards and a half-empty can of spray paint, the same color used to deface my no trespassing signs. Karen tried to play dumb, claiming that Chandler had stored the tools there without her knowledge, but it was clear that she had orchestrated everything. Both Chandler and Karen were arrested on charges of criminal mischief and trespassing. Karen made bail by lunchtime, but Chandler wasn't so lucky. His criminal history, specifically a 2021 probation violation for a check-kiting scheme, meant he was held without bond pending further review. The wheels of justice were in motion, but this was only the beginning. As the investigation continued, the picture of what Karen and Chandler had been up to became clearer and darker. This wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was a conspiracy. While Chandler sat in jail, the fallout from the arrests began to ripple outward. It was one thing to deal with an angry neighbor, another to uncover the depth of the betrayal and manipulation that Karen and Chandler had orchestrated. I had expected some pushback from Karen, but the discovery of fraud within the HOA was a whole new nightmare. It became clear that this was far more than just a land dispute. It was an intricate web of lies, theft, and deceit. As soon as Chandler was behind bars, I knew that the next step was to dive into the financial side of things. With everything that had happened, the HOA's involvement was too suspicious to ignore. I contacted my lawyer Elliot and we began digging into the HOA's financial records, hoping to trace the $3,500 that Karen had used to buy the gate she had installed on my property. At first, we thought it might be a small oversight, a single fraudulent transaction. But what we found was far worse. We were able to subpoena the HOA's bank records, and that's when the truth came crashing down. There, in black and white, was a cashier's check signed by Chandler, drawn from the HOA's reserve account used to purchase the gate. This wasn't just an isolated act of theft, it was the tip of the iceberg. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Chandler, who handled the HOA's bookkeeping, had been writing checks for grounds improvements that never took place. The most troubling part, those checks totaled nearly $46,900. The documents were fabricated. The improvements listed were non-existent. Chandler had been siphoning money from the HOA for years, and it was clear that Karen had been complicit in this scheme. The HOA board was stunned. They had no idea that Chandler, the very person who had been managing their finances, had been embezzling funds. The board members who trusted him implicitly were horrified by the magnitude of the fraud. In the wake of this discovery, they convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to press charges against Chandler. The betrayal was personal for many of them, especially those who had worked closely with him. Detective Miriam Page from the county's white-collar crime unit was brought in to handle the investigation. She was thorough and meticulous, and once she got her hands on Chandler's home computer, it was clear that things were about to spiral. The computer contained an alarming amount of evidence: forged receipts, fake meeting minutes, and even a Word template for the neon green approval stamps that had been used on counterfeit documents. It was like Chandler had been running a shadow operation within the HOA, and Karen had been fully aware of it. But what really turned the case on its head was the discovery of the payments that Chandler had funneled directly to Karen. The records showed that Chandler had transferred several $1,000s into Karen's personal bank account, labeled as consulting fees for her assistance in the various projects he had orchestrated. It became apparent that Karen had been in on the scam the entire time. She wasn't just a victim of Chandler's actions, she was an active participant. Karen, now facing serious charges herself, quickly lawyered up. She hired a high-priced defense attorney, James Hall, who charged $600 an hour. His first move was to deny everything. Hall claimed that Karen had no idea that Chandler had been embezzling funds from the HOA. According to him, she was just a casual participant in the gate installation and had no knowledge of Chandler's criminal activities. But the evidence was stacking up against her. Chandler, on the other hand, was facing a much more difficult situation. His probation violation for the 2021 check-kiting scheme had already placed him in a precarious position. His arrest for the HOA fraud gave the court an opening to revoke his probation, and it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to escape the consequences of his actions. But Chandler was desperate. With a new felony charge hanging over him, he agreed to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. Chandler's decision to testify against Karen would be the turning point in the case. In exchange for his cooperation, the district attorney offered Chandler a 4-year sentence with the possibility of parole in 2 years. It was a better deal than he had expected, but it came with a major caveat. He would have to testify truthfully against Karen and reveal the full extent of the scheme they had been running. Chandler agreed without hesitation. The courtroom was tense when Chandler took the stand. His testimony was damning. He detailed how Karen had orchestrated the entire plot to annex my land, promising him a share of the property once the HOA successfully took control of it. In exchange, Chandler had handled all the paperwork and the illegal tasks, including the fraudulent transactions and vandalism, all while pretending to be a trusted member of the HOA. Chandler's testimony was corroborated by the footage from my Ring camera, which the prosecution played for the jury. The video clearly showed Chandler and Karen loading rebar into Karen's SUV at 12:47 a.m. on the night the stakes had disappeared. The timestamp matched perfectly with the time the stakes had been removed from my property. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning their verdict, guilty on all counts. Karen was convicted of felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and misdemeanor trespassing. Her bond was revoked, and she was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with an additional $32,000 restitution to me and $46,900 to the HOA. The restitution would be paid through her prison wages, but it was a hollow victory for her. It was the price of her greed and betrayal. As for me, the verdict brought a sense of relief. Justice had been served. But as the gavel fell, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The battle had been long and hard, but the end of this chapter marked the beginning of something new. The courtroom buzzed with the weight of the verdict. Karen had been found guilty on all charges: felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and misdemeanor trespassing. It was a bittersweet moment for me. Justice had been served, yes, but it had come at such a high cost. The stress of the legal battle, the constant fear of further retaliation, and the emotional toll it had taken on me, it all had to be accounted for. But the gavel had fallen, and Karen's bond was revoked immediately. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with restitution totaling $32,000 to me and $46,900 to the HOA. The restitution would come through her prison wages, and considering her criminal history, it was unlikely that she would ever be able to pay the entire amount. Still, the court's decision offered a sense of closure. There was something poetic about the fact that the money she had stolen from the HOA would now be returned, and that her own actions had directly led to her downfall. I didn't expect the money back anytime soon, but at least it was a step toward reparation. Despite everything, Karen's expression during sentencing remained defiant. She didn't show a hint of remorse, but when her eyes briefly met mine, I gave her a polite wave, nothing more. There was no need for anger, no need for satisfaction. I had fought for my land, for my peace, and now it was over. It was a strange feeling, closure, but not the kind I had expected. In some ways, it felt anticlimactic. The damage had been done, but the hardest part was behind me. The fallout from the case spread quickly throughout the community. News of Karen's arrest and the fraud within the HOA made headlines, and many of our neighbors expressed their shock. People who had once spoken highly of her were now questioning how they had ever trusted her. Chandler's arrest and subsequent testimony exposed the full scope of what had been happening under the surface. But for me, the focus had shifted to what came next. It wasn't just about what Karen and Chandler had done. It was about rebuilding, about finding a way to move forward. The HOA, in the wake of the scandal, was forced to overhaul its leadership. The board, once complicit in Chandler's schemes, was replaced by a new team of individuals who were determined to regain the trust of the community. One of the first actions they took was to issue a formal apology to me for the way they had handled the situation, and they sent me a check for $4,500. This money, they explained, had been recovered from Chandler's frozen assets and was meant to cover the costs of repairing the damage done to my beehives. It wasn't enough to erase the emotional toll of the entire ordeal, but it was a gesture I appreciated nonetheless. With the legal battles and HOA issues behind me, I finally had the opportunity to turn my attention to the land. The creek was quiet again, and the property that had been marred by Karen's schemes now felt like a blank slate. It was time to rebuild, not just physically but emotionally. The last few months had been filled with tension, uncertainty, and fear. But as I stood on my land, feeling the sun on my face and the breeze in the trees, I realized that this was my chance for a fresh start. I decided to build a greenhouse where Karen had once tried to annex my property. The space that had once been a battleground for control was now being transformed into a place of growth. The air was thick with the smell of fresh soil and tomato starts. The beehives, though damaged, had been repaired, and the bees were thriving once again, buzzing with life. The flowers were blooming, the vegetables were growing, and Pixel, my loyal dog, seemed to understand that we had finally found peace. The most satisfying part of all was watching the land come back to life. What had once been a source of tension was now a sanctuary. Every morning, as I walked along the creek with Pixel by my side, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The nightmares of the past year seemed to fade with each passing day. But that wasn't the end of the story. A few months later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Elaine Castor, claiming to be the heir and next of kin to Karen. The letter stated that Elaine was asserting a private right-of-way across my land, claiming that Karen had granted it to her before she was incarcerated. The audacity of it all took me by surprise. It felt like a last-ditch effort to continue the fight Karen had started, but I wasn't about to be intimidated again. With the legal work and surveillance from the previous case still fresh in my mind, I called Elliot, my lawyer. Together, we quickly uncovered the truth. Elaine's claim was a fabrication. The deed she presented was a forgery. We filed a motion to dismiss the claim, and a few weeks later, Elaine withdrew her case before the hearing. It was another victory, but by that point, it felt like a small win in the grand scheme of things. As the seasons changed, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The land, once marred by betrayal and conflict, had been restored not just to its original beauty but to something better. What had started as a fight for my property had evolved into a journey of healing and renewal. I had rebuilt the physical space, but more importantly, I had rebuilt my sense of self. Through it all, I had learned that the greatest victories often come not from vanquishing your enemies, but from reclaiming your own peace. And that peace was worth more than anything Karen or Chandler could ever take from me. As the dust settled and life slowly returned to normal, I began to see the silver lining that had been hidden beneath the chaos of the past year. Karen and Chandler's schemes were behind me, and with the legal battles finally over, I could begin to look forward instead of back. The land was healing, and so was I. It wasn't just about getting my property back. It was about rediscovering my sense of purpose and reclaiming the space that had been so fiercely contested. The greenhouse, built where Karen had once tried to annex my land, became a symbol of that transformation. The tomatoes, peppers, and herbs I planted thrived, their green leaves reaching toward the sun as if in defiance of the turmoil that had once threatened to uproot everything. The bees were busy once more, buzzing in and out of their hives, and Pixel, my loyal dog, had found his place again, bounding through the fields without a care in the world. Then came an unexpected opportunity. One afternoon, I received an invitation from Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit that had purchased Karen's former property. They had heard about my work with the land, and they wanted me to consult on planting native pollinators and creating a sustainable environment for their new community garden. It was surreal to think that the very land Karen had once tried to control would now be a place for growth, both for plants and people. The irony was not lost on me. The land that had been the battleground for control was now going to be a garden for the community. The first volunteer day was a turning point. As I stood there with a shovel in hand, working alongside neighbors, new HOA members, and even Deputy Rogers, who had become a friend through all of this, I realized how far I had come. The work was hard, but it was therapeutic. We transformed what had once been an overgrown lawn into raised beds for vegetables, paths for walking, and spaces for laughter and connection. It felt right. Everything that had been wrong had been made right, and we were building something beautiful together. In many ways, this was my fresh start. The community garden was a physical manifestation of the new chapter I was stepping into. It wasn't just about the plants. It was about creating a space of unity, peace, and purpose, something Karen's vision had never been able to achieve. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. A year after everything had settled, life had taken on a rhythm I hadn't known for a long time. The stress of the past had given way to a peaceful, productive routine. The land was thriving, and so was I, but just when I thought I could finally take a breath and move forward without looking back, I received a letter that threatened to drag me back into the past once more. It was from Elaine Castor, a woman claiming to be the heir and next of kin to Karen. The letter stated that Elaine had been granted a private right-of-way across my land by Karen before she was incarcerated, and now, as her legal successor, she intended to enforce it. To say that I was shocked would be an understatement. The audacity of it all was staggering. This wasn't just an attempt to rehash Karen's old schemes, it was an open challenge, an effort to create legal uncertainty and force me into a settlement. At first, the old anger flared up. The thought of Karen's name coming up again, of dealing with yet another person trying to claim something that wasn't theirs, was infuriating. But then, after a few moments to breathe, I remembered how far I'd come. I remembered the work I'd done to heal my land, to build something new. I wasn't going to let Elaine drag me back into the mess. With Elliot, my lawyer, on the case once again, we quickly set to work. We dug into Elaine's claim and found that it was nothing more than a poorly constructed lie. The deed she provided was a forgery, and the private right-of-way she claimed was nowhere in any official record. The entire situation was designed to confuse and pressure me into giving up a portion of my land. But with the legal groundwork already in place from the previous case, I knew we had the upper hand. It didn't take long for Elaine to realize that her claim wouldn't hold up in court. With the evidence we had and the records in place, she withdrew her case before we even had to set foot in front of a judge. It was a win, but it didn't feel like much of a victory. In a way, it felt more like an unnecessary reminder that some people would never stop trying to take what wasn't theirs. But that was the last time I'd hear from Elaine or from anyone trying to challenge my ownership. By now, I was ready to move on completely. With the legal threats behind me, I focused more on the land and the opportunities that continued to unfold. The Sprout Tomorrow community garden flourished, and with each passing season it grew bigger and more vibrant. It wasn't just a place where vegetables were grown, it had become a sanctuary for everyone involved. What had once been a symbol of Karen's greed had been transformed into a symbol of collaboration, growth, and renewal. As spring turned to summer, I received a letter from the state's Crime Victim Fund, which had been set up to provide restitution for victims of fraud. Apparently, some of the stolen money from Karen's various schemes had been recovered, and a portion of it had been allocated to me. The check wasn't large, just a few $100s, but the symbolism of it was powerful. Karen's prison wages were being garnished to pay for her crimes, and though it would take decades to clear her debt, the thought that some of the money she had stolen from me was coming back felt like a quiet victory. Then came an unexpected gesture. Chandler, now incarcerated for his role in the fraud, sent me a letter. It was a simple apology, one that acknowledged the harm he had caused. But what struck me was the hand-drawn map he had enclosed, suggesting a layout for an orchard on my property. It was odd, to say the least. Chandler, the man who had once conspired to take what was mine, now offering advice on how to cultivate something from it. But I couldn't deny the sincerity in his words. His apology, though far too late to undo the damage, was a step in the right direction. I wrote back to him, not offering forgiveness but acknowledging his effort. I told him that the sunflowers were growing taller than ever and that the bees were thriving. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small act of grace, a way to close the chapter on the past once and for all. As the seasons continued to shift, I realized that life had come full circle. The land, once the site of conflict and betrayal, was now a place of beauty and growth. The community garden flourished, the bees buzzed happily, and Pixel ran joyfully through the fields. I had fought for this land, and in doing so, I had fought for my own peace. What had started as a battle over property had become a journey of healing and renewal. Now, as I stood in my greenhouse, surrounded by the fruits of my labor, I knew I had finally found the peace I had been searching for. The future was mine to shape, and it was brighter than I could have ever imagined. It had been over a year since Karen's trial, and the changes I had undergone were nothing short of transformative. The past, which had once been filled with turmoil and conflict, had given way to a new beginning, one I never expected. My land, once a battleground for control, had now become a place of growth, both for plants and for my spirit. The community garden that Sprout Tomorrow had established was thriving, and I found myself spending more and more time there, nurturing the space that Karen had once tried to take from me. But what struck me most about this time was the full circle moment that had come into focus. I had spent so much time protecting what was mine, fighting for my land and my peace. Yet, as the years passed, I realized that the battle itself had been about more than property. It had been about reclaiming my sense of self, my connection to the land, and my ability to move forward in a world that often seemed determined to knock me back. One of the more poignant moments in this journey came when Sprout Tomorrow reached out to me again, this time inviting me to be part of something even bigger. They had decided to turn Karen's old property, now empty and still, for a new initiative, planting native pollinators across the land to restore biodiversity to the area. They wanted my input. They wanted me to consult on the design and implementation, knowing that I had a deep connection to the land that went beyond the legal battle. It felt like an opportunity to not only reclaim the physical space, but to also contribute to something lasting. This wasn't just about repairing the damage that Karen had done. It was about creating a lasting legacy, one that would help the